You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme,
our unity here proves that the very idea of international law remains alive and effective.
Volodymyr Zelensky speaking at the Ukraine Peace Summit, which ended in Switzerland yesterday, will join our Zurich studio to get feedback from the event. A trial date for the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich has been set in Russia. We'll take another look at this case and ask how it impacts foreign correspondents in the country. After worse than expected European parliamentary results, Greece has announced a cabinet reshuffle. We'll look at how this might affect future polls. And finally, one of the contenders for last night's Tony Awards, Eddie Redmayne, as the MC in Cabaret, will be in Manhattan after Broadway's biggest night of the year. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. Yesterday saw the conclusion of a two-day summit in Switzerland dedicated to forging a path forward to end the war in Ukraine. More than 80 countries and international organisations agreed to a joint communiqué, but some key powers refused to sign. Well, I'm joined now from our Zurich studios by Monocle's contributor and foreign desk host, Andrew Muller, who was there at the summit. Andrew, who else was there?
A large roll-up, actually, and it was a lot more of a thing than I think a lot of people had been anticipating. There was kind of a heavy vibe hanging over the days before the conference. This idea had got out that this was all going to be a bit of a busted flush, but actually a surprisingly healthy roll-up. At least 80 countries, another dozen or so international organisations, as you said, and there were some, there were big players there, absent Russia, who obviously weren't invited, and China, who didn't turn up. There were very few other total no-shows. Even a country like Brazil, which wasn't all that enthused about it, did at least send along somebody so it could claim to be an observer. It was, when they were all gathered in one place, an actually pretty startling display of resolve and a reminder of how great the powers arrayed behind Ukraine are.
So what actually happened at the summit?
Well, from where we were sitting in the media centre, which for large parts of the summit may have well been on the moon, it was kind of hard to tell. But we did get a few visitations in person. On the first day, Zelensky visited the media centre, and yesterday, on the last day, he visited the media centre along with the presidents of Chile and Ghana and the European Commission and Switzerland and the Prime Minister of Canada. And you could see the symbolism there. I think it was very important to have the presidents of Ghana and Chile, a reminder that, contrary to conventional wisdom, quite a lot of the global south actually is on board with Ukraine. It was very skillfully managed in terms of the visuals, but the agreements that were concluded, I thought, were actually pretty interesting and a lot more substantial than people had been expecting. There is this idea that the process set in motion will proceed on three areas where you would think / hope even Russia might agree that there was enough mutual interest, i.e. food security, nuclear security, and the return home of people who have been either taken prisoner on the battlefield or, in the case of many thousands of Ukrainian children, simply abducted. And I think the thinking is that either Russia at least comes some of the way to discuss those issues, much as they did with the Black Sea grain deal, at least for a time, or Russia paints itself as even more intractable in the eyes of global opinion.
So those points presumably were what made up the bulk of the communiqué. I wonder who didn't sign it.
Yeah, there were a few no-shows on the communique final signature. Saudi Arabia, India, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, the United Arab Emirates, and there's obviously some significant names there. Zelensky certainly, and he did stick around after the joint photo call at the media centre by himself to take a few actual questions. Was at pains to seem completely unfazed by this. He said, look, he did say that basically you can't get 100 countries or 80 countries in one room and expect everybody to agree on everything. He does understand that other people have their own agendas. The sticking point, I think, for those countries was this idea of absolutely pinning your name to the idea of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And I think there are those countries who do, I think, mutter under their breath that at some point there will have to be some conversations about perhaps some exchange of territory for peace, reluctant though Ukraine would be. But that said, for all that Saudi Arabia's name is not on the communique, when the rumour was put to Zelensky that Saudi Arabia might be the host of the next summit, he absolutely, well, I think all but nodded and winked and suggested that, yes, that is very much on the cards.
Although I understand a follow-up summit hasn't been absolutely nailed down.
Not yet, no, but Zelensky was very keen that this happens sooner rather than later. The first thing he said when he came to the media centre on the first day was he kept referring to this as the first or the inaugural. He, I think, is clear that a conversation needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be a prominent conversation with heads of state, heads of government, it kind of a little parallel United Nations where Russia doesn't get a veto. I think when you think of it that way, it's actually a fairly cunning construct. You know, he's managed to get this first thing up to the gate with the help of the Swiss hosts. People are now involved in a process, and even for those countries which turned up and didn't sign, if they fail to turn up at future things, then it looks like they have walked away from a peace process as well. So he has quite cleverly, I think, yoked quite a large chunk of the world into his idea of how this war can be brought to an end.
And do you think it will move the needle?
It's hard to say, but I think people, certainly the ones I spoke to who had been in the rooms or adjacent to the rooms, were surprised by how constructive and productive it had been. I think there had been, as I was saying before the conference, a feeling that this could possibly all have been an email, like what was going to happen, either other than everybody getting together and agreeing once again, Ukraine has been attacked for no reason, Ukraine needs its territory back. But there is examples here, I think, of some fresh thinking and a fresh approach, and it will be interesting to see what happens next whenever and wherever it happens.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That was Andrew Muller in our Zurich studio. Now, here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved his 6-member war cabinet after the departure of centrist Benny Gantz. The war cabinet had been in operation ever since Gantz joined a national unity government after the October 7th attack by Hamas. Russian President Vladimir Putin is confirmed to visit Vietnam later this week, drawing criticism from the United States, which had upgraded relations with Hanoi last year. The U.S. Embassy in Hanoi criticized Vietnam for giving Putin a platform amid the war in Ukraine. Police in Zimbabwe have arrested opposition leader Jameson Timber and 80 others for holding an unauthorized political gathering. Timber has been leader of the country's opposition since January. And Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he discussed ways of improving military communication with China and avoiding unexpected incidents as part of talks with his Chinese counterpart Li Qingyang. The Chinese Prime Minister's visit to Canberra is part of a thawing of relations with Australia. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Carlotta. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who's been held in Moscow's high-security Lefortovo prison since last March, will appear in court on charges of espionage in a closed trial on the 26th of June in Yekaterinburg in the Urals. If found guilty, he could face up to 20 years in prison. Well, I'm joined now by Anne Simmons, who's Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And I wonder if you can remind us of why Evan was arrested.
Well, basically, the Federal Security Service of Russia, the FSB, claims or alleges that Evan was caught trying to obtain classified material from a defense contractor in Russia on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency. Of course, this is a false allegation. Evan, at the time, was on assignment for the Wall Street Journal in Yekaterinburg, so he was basically on a reporting assignment.
Mm-hmm. What do we know about the circumstances under which he's been held right now?
He's been held at Lefortovo prison in Moscow, and this is a detention center that dates back to the Stalin era. Very grim conditions. He's been held in a small cell. He's been kept there 90% of his time, about 23 hours a day. He's allowed an hour of exercise. He's doing his best to keep his spirits up in terms of reading a lot, meditating, exercising, and so the conditions are grim, but Evan has been extremely resilient from what we know.
And so what's the latest on the upcoming trial?
Well, this basically moves Evan's case into a new phase. The June 26th date is either going to be the beginning of pre-trial motions, a hearing, or it might be the start of the trial itself. That's unclear. Now, it's going to be a trial behind closed doors in complete secrecy. Evan will not receive kind of due process that he would in the United States or other countries. It's unclear what kind of evidence the FSB says it has gathered against Evan, because Russian authorities have not released any information or any evidence publicly. Again, the Wall Street Journal, the US government, and Evan himself categorically deny that he was doing any kind of espionage. He was on a reporting assignment.
And if he is convicted, what happens next?
If he is convicted, espionage cases or convictions can see a defendant face up to 20 years in prison. He would likely be moved to a penal colony. Many foreign nationals who have allegedly committed crimes in Russia have been taken to a penal colony called Mordovia, just outside of Moscow, where the conditions are quite grim, quite crowded, and that would probably be the destination. But it is unclear whether or not a conviction will happen and whether or not indeed Evan will eventually be moved to another prison.
And I wonder what impact this case has had on the foreign correspondents based in Russia. What are the reporting restrictions, and are journalists actually self-censoring?
Well, this case has certainly had a chilling effect, if we can put it that way, on the journalism or journalist corps in Russia. It's really challenging to report in Russia today. Reporters can be harassed while out reporting on sensitive stories, especially now that the environment is so negative towards foreign correspondents, because authorities have said that, they accuse Western journalists of trying to denigrate Russia and portray the country in a negative light. Russian authorities do not want you to use the word war to describe what is happening in Ukraine. They want it to be called a special military operation. There are other pitfalls when it comes to cultivating new sources, because you really don't know in this current climate whether or not people are really legitimate sources sharing legitimate information or trying to entrap you. You've got to be careful, vigilant when it comes to phone calls, your digital correspondence, and even talking to Russians who actually, brave it and decide they want to speak to you. You could be putting their lives in jeopardy, because there are strict rules against speaking to foreign reporters today. And again, foreign reporters do have accreditation, and in theory, this gives you permission to go out and report inside the country.
Anne Simmons, thank you very much indeed. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, the Greek cabinet was reshuffled on Friday after the Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis' centre-right party performed worse than expected in Sunday's election to the European Parliament. Well, I'm joined now by Evdoxia Limperi, who's UK correspondent for ERT, the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation. Evdoxia, many thanks for coming on The Briefing. Can you remind us of just the figures surrounding Greece's EU election results?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you for having me. The results were New Democracy, the governing party, came first with 28.3%. Syriza, the main opposition party, came second with 14.92%. And the Socialist Party, PASOK, came third. With I don't have the percentages of the other parties here with me now, but they all of them lost, except the big winner was the Hellenic Solution and Niki, a minor party, but both of them are standing at the right of the center-right party, New Democracy, and they are ultra-nationalist parties.
So what do you think the reason for these results were?
The reason, first of all, we have to say that there was a massive abstention from the Greek voters. It reached 60%, reached nearly 60%, and it's the biggest ever in Greek voting. And it is not something, usually the Greeks go and vote in the elections. Not this time, they didn't choose to vote. So the reason of this is considered to be the cost of living crisis, but also because European elections have always the character of a looser vote, they don't. And if we add the fact that this is the fifth time that Greek voters have gone to the polls in 13 months, so the perception is that there's no immediate national stakes and that the elections did not coincide with time. This time with a parallel election like local elections that has happened in the past. So the voters leave an additional incentive to participate in the 2024 European elections. And so we arrived to this historical record of 60%. But the disappointment was mainly for the cost of living crisis and all the other reasons I just mentioned.
So tell us about the reshuffle.
The reshuffle, yes. Nevertheless, the high abstention rate does not allow us to draw safe conclusions from what happened. New Democracy, though, finished, as I said, first, but falling short of the 33% target. The leader, PM Mr. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, had put as threshold. After losing the backing of about 1 million voters compared to last summer's national general elections, the Greek PM has sought to reshuffle his center party government last Friday, excluding 11 members, but securing policy consistency with the foreign and finance and defense ministers keeping their places. Taking stock of the results, the Greek PM admitted that the vote did not meet the target of his party and had said that his party had said, but the people did not choose their position either, he said. For Mr. Mitsotakis, this was a message from the citizens for more work and fewer mistakes, as he put it. So he said as priority the cost of living crisis, putting Takis Theodorikakos to lead the Ministry of Development, who is considered to be more of, I open quotes, layman and tougher than his predecessor Kostas Skrekas. Also, another priority was migration. Interestingly, the new Minister for Migration and Asylum is Nikos Panagiotopoulos, who is considered to be a more right-wing official, previously having served at the Defense Ministry. Also, the new leadership of the Labour Ministry has to run a series of reforms and policies which, while according to exit polls, the private sector employees' votes to New Democracy fell. So he probably wanted to address these issues, and the replacement from Domna Mihailidou, who is considered to be an error-prone, in quotes, by Niki Kerameos, who was moved from the Interior Ministry, is considered a choice of a more experienced person. Last but not least, the modernization of the state was a priority for Kyriakos Mitsotakis. He referred to the modernization organization of the Supreme Council for Civil Personnel Selection, which is called ASEP in Greek. So it's and also the extension of the postal vote in national elections. Hence, he changed the Ministry of Interior there to address these issues mainly.
And Evdoxia, do you think that this will make a difference in future polls? Will this reshuffle make the party likely to do much better?
Yes. Well, the estimation is that these choices are more of a low-key, in quotes, officials who have never caused any negative publicity with their behavior. And there was, however, a specific rationale, as I said, behind its choice. I mentioned three of them, what was the rationale, but mainly that's his plan, at least Greek PM's plan to make an effect, to change the party, the voters' choice, and to attract them back again from a little bit more right to the edges, like they went as the results show.
Evdoxia Limperi, thank you very much indeed. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Well, it's time now for the latest business headlines with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, the French far-right leader Marine Le Pen is seeking to reassure investors about what would happen if her party tops the poll in the parliamentary elections. So what did she say?
Georgina, we're seeing a modest rebound in French stocks today. The CAC up some 0.3%. Last week saw a dramatic sell-off in French assets on those political worries. The Paris stock market dropped more than 6% over the course of last week, wiping over $200 billion off its value. And the gap in yield between French and German bonds grew to its widest since 2012. The far-right leader, Marine Le Pen, has been seeking to cool investors' nerves somewhat. She's saying that she would work with President Emmanuel Macron and not seek to eject him should her party prevail in those parliamentary elections later this month. She also told Le Figaro newspaper that she is respectful of institutions and is not calling for institutional chaos. Latest polls put Macron's party in third place, behind not only Le Pen's National Rally, but also a left-wing coalition. They've put forward plans to pick apart most of Macron's 7 years of economic reforms and potentially put France on a collision course with the European Union over fiscal policy. The investors not particularly keen on either of those options. The first round of voting, of course, takes place in just under 2 weeks' time.
Ewan, let's talk aviation now, because there's more trouble for Boeing with the number of whistleblower reports soaring this year.
Yeah, the US Federal Aviation Administration has received 126 Boeing whistleblower reports just in the first 5 months of this year, compared to only 11 in all of 2023. Now, that surge shines light on the intense scrutiny being faced by the planemaker after that fuselage panel blew off the 737 MAX jetliner mid-flight in January. US investigators have said that the piece was missing 4 bolts meant to secure it in place, a revelation that helped to unearth a series of manufacturing quality lapses at the company. The regulator says it expects to see an increase in reports when there's a safe place for employees to report. Boeing also says it's encouraging employees to submit safety concerns with an internal program called Speak Up. But the numbers from the FAA come just a couple of days after another Bloomberg report on a safety incident off the coast of Hawaii. Back in April, a Southwest Airlines flight came within 400 feet of the ocean. The 737 MAX 8 jet briefly dropped by more than 4,000 feet a minute before the flight crew pulled up to avoid disaster. No one was injured in the incident, but it's just another unwelcome story for Boeing.
Ewan, thank you. That was Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. The 77th Annual Tony Awards for Excellence in Broadway Theatre took place at the Lincoln Center in New York last night. Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times, was there, and he joins us now from Manhattan. Matt, I understand you only had a couple of hours' sleep. Was it a good party?
Yes, it was, and I'm staying actually right opposite Lincoln Center, so that was just by chance. So it felt like I was sort of already in the midst of it, which is very useful.
Absolutely. So who were the biggest winners?
Well, it was very interesting. It was a very egalitarian Tonys. Very often there are years where the producers might sweep or Moulin Rouge or something like that. But there were 15 musicals opening in the last month or so of the Broadway season just gone. And so there were a lot of shows that needed a boost from the Tonys. The Tonys are very, very important for the commercial viability and future of these shows. So what happened was, instead of giving all the trophies to one show, there were, 3 or 4 for this one, 3 or 4 for that one, whatever. The best musical was actually the one I would have voted for, but it was not the expected choice. It was a musical version of The Outsiders, the Susie Hinton novel about sort of teenage rebellion and gang warfare in 1960s Oklahoma. And it was, of course, made into a Francis Coppola movie in the early 80s. And it's a really, really stirring, stunning Broadway production. Danya Taymor, who's Julie Taymor, the woman who directed Lion King, Julie Taymor's niece, she was the surprise winner for Best Director. And when that happened, I think everyone thought that the show would go on to win Best Musical, and indeed it did. And then the spoils were divided very equitably throughout. I'm a big Sondheim fan, as I think listeners know. And so I was very pleased with the awards for Merrily We Roll Along, a Sondheim show that had been an epic flop on Broadway back in 1981. Now it's a huge hit with Daniel Radcliffe and Jonathan Groff, both of whom won Tonys for their performances, and it won for Best Musical Revival as well. And so it's really going out with an extraordinary bang, given how disastrously it did 4 decades ago.
Were there any notable snubs?
Notable snubs? Well, Best Actress in a Play was interesting because there were some very good contenders. Jessica Lange, who was doing her first ever contemporary play on Broadway called Mother Play. Rachel McAdams, the film actress, who, as far as I know, has never done a play professionally at all until she did this play, Mary Jane. So very often Broadway likes it when people from one world drop into another world, film going over to theater. But neither of these women won the award for Best Actress. That one went to Sarah Paulson. And Hell's Kitchen, a musical about the part of Manhattan known as Hell's Kitchen, got 13 nominations, but in the end only won 2 for two of its female actors. So I think that the producers of Hell's Kitchen will be slightly disappointed today, because to go in with 13 nominations and get 2 is, in the end, is a bit of a shock.
And what about performances there? I know that Alicia Keys, Jay-Z and various others were on stage.
Well, yes, Alicia Keys, the Hell's Kitchen is an Alicia Keys jukebox musical, basically. And that number with Jay-Z was right at the beginning of the show. And it was very interesting because I think I read that they had 6 or 7 minutes of airtime. And normally in these ceremonies, you might get 3 or 4. So they got double. And I think that, the ratings for the Tonys are very important. I think they wanted to begin with somebody well-known that, Mr. and Mrs., Middle America would recognize, and then watch the show right through to the end. So that was interesting. There's a show on Broadway, which is a dance musical by Justin Peck, who runs New York City Ballet, called Illinois. And that was interesting to watch because there's no singing, it's just movement. And I wonder how that will have played to Middle America. But the numbers all, some came across better than others. The Merrily number was very sweet because that show is finishing in 3 weeks on July 7th. And the number was a great reminder of the fantastic rapport that Jonathan Groff and Daniel Radcliffe have developed over the run of the show, which has been running off and on for over a year now. And you can really tell that they're there for each other. And when each one won the award, the other one was incredibly excited. Do
you think that the awards give a fair representation of what is good on Broadway right now?
I think they do. Sometimes they can be a bit snooty. I went to a show the other night called The Heart of Rock and Roll, which is basically a jukebox musical of Huey Lewis and the News. The same guy who's The Power of Love is featuring in Back to the Future, the musical, on both sides of the Atlantic. And indeed, The Power of Love is in this show. And it's a delightful show that doesn't want to reinvent the world. It just wants to give the audience a good time. But I think the Tony voters thought, oh, no, this is too plebeian. We're not going to allow this a nomination. So even though it's one of the most purely delightful shows I've seen on Broadway in a very long time, it got 0 nominations. So the Tonys can be quite high-minded at times. But I do think it was very good this year that they spread the wealth so that everyone came away with something, as opposed to, 1 or 2 shows dominating.
Is that the right way, though? Isn't it a bit like a kids' sports day where you've just got to make everyone feel they didn't lose even though they weren't great?
Well, no, I think what it is recognizing that the talent across these shows is very diverse. So, Hell's Kitchen had some wonderful performances. Maybe it wasn't the best show of the season. The Outsiders was very thrilling to behold, and maybe that is the best show of the season. There's a musical called Suffs about the suffragist movement by a woman, Shana Taub, who's also in it. And Hillary Clinton, in fact, is one of the producers of it. She appeared to introduce the segment on it. So, I think it's just reminding people that Broadway can accommodate lots of different voices, lots of different themes, lots of different shows.
Excellent. Matt Wolfe speaking to us from Manhattan. Thank you very much indeed. And that's all we have time for on this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Chris Chermack. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. And The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.